Hello, everyone. My name is Valeria Santa Cruz, and welcome to Group 5's presentation. We decided to focus on the role of communication and gender social identity from the social identity theory. So, what is social identity? I'll be inserting a clip here so you can get more information on it.
In social identity theory, a social identity is a person's knowledge that he or she belongs to a social category or group. Like if you're in a math club, or maybe a fight club, you share the same interests as others in that specific group, so you're identified as such a person. As stated earlier, there are many different traits that make up who you are. For example, you could simply say, I'm a male, which will lump you into an admittedly very face value definition of yourself, but you can add in a great number of other aspects of yourself when describing your identity. You could say, I'm a male, I'm single, I'm an A-grade student, and I'd rather stay in and play video games on a Friday night than go to a bar and pick up some babes. I think most would agree that description falls in line with a nerd or geek stereotype. A love of video games defines you, but also lumps you into an enormous culture of gamers or nerds, reducing individuality, whether you like it or not. Identities then could be defined as not what you are as a whole, but in terms of more or less arbitrarily selected features that you possess. This could make you say, hey man, my love of video games doesn't define me. I'm much more complex than that. You didn't mention that I speak 5 different languages, am a nationally ranked pole vaulter, and do charity work every second weekend. This also links right back onto identity salience, the hierarchy of your interests and beliefs, not to mention those of other people. Whether or not gaming registers as much in the brains of others really does influence whether you'll be linked to that particular identity. If you're hanging out with your pole vaulting buddies, you'll most likely be introduced to strangers as a pole vaulter. That's how you'll register in their brains.
So, now what is gender social identity? According to northwestern.edu, gender identity refers to an individual's sense of self as a male, female, or combination of both or neither, and influences how individuals think and act. Gender within society. Gender roles are something that's expected from a male or female, how he or she should be behaving, dressing, and even grooming. Females are expected to be polite, dress very feminine, and are considered delicate flowers. Females are the caretakers of the household, partners on the side, the emotional ones, and the ones who are nurturing. The male gender role is viewed as aggressive, masculine, the bread maker, and the head of household. Society says men are weak if they show any type of emotions. When it comes to occupations, the bigger roles, such as doctors and engineers, are always painted towards males, while the female roles are painted as nurses and educators. We live in a world where everything is changing. The phrase, it's 2021, means a lot. It's basically saying, come on, you still think men or women should be doing that? Times are changing and will continue to do so. Gender communication. There's a long list of verbal and nonverbal cues we might or might not notice about one another when communicating. It can also always just depend on the person and how their personality is. According to some research done, there are many different cues that female or males fit into. Some examples include facial expressions, touch, physical contact, and space. The female gender tends to speak a lot of nonverbal language by using facial expressions. Males tend to do the opposite. Females tend to use more eye contact, while men, again, are the opposite. As mentioned before, I believe it just comes down how to someone is brought up or their personality. As long as someone knows you're engaged in conversation and listening, I think that's what makes a person a good person. Social identity theory is composed of 4 stages. Social categorization is the act of either society or ourselves categorizing who we are into certain social categories. Mexican, woman, gay, trans, disabled, neurotypical are all examples of categories that we or society can put ourselves in. Some are categorized based on their appearance, beliefs, or cultural standings. With these categories come certain stereotypes or roles that are to be fulfilled. Some of these categories and their stereotypes for the female gender include being given pink and blue clothing as a baby, or having a gender reveal party where blue means boy and pink means girl. Adult females in America are generally expected to either want to have children in their life or already have a plan to settle down and have a family. Social change is allowing stereotypes like this to become less significant, but is still an expected part of life for females culturally, regardless whether or not they can or want to conceive. Connotation, whatever. Social identity formation, positive or negative. Once we or someone else categorizes us, we're able to form an identity around this categorization. When you form an identity, there is a possibility that it can have a positive or negative connotation. Being female versus male in general has a neutral identity. However, there, there are situations where identifying as a male or female may be positive or negative. For example, a female may not be treated as fairly in a male dominated field like careers in STEM. The same could be said for men who decide to be in a female dominated career, such as education. In both stances, their gender negatively affects the way society may see their ability to do their job. This attribute affecting them may change based on any situation. Social comparison. When we identify with a group, we strive to belong to a group that has a positive identity. Social comparison is one way we differentiate our group from others. However, we generally only compare ourselves to those right above or right below us in that status. But how does this apply to gender identity? Females, in order to feel more feminine or valid, may attack those who pose a threat in their identity. Same can be said for men and their masculinity. In a study by Marcus Kammelmeyer and Daphne Oyserman, it has been found that when we asked to compare themselves to peers that they believed to be doing worse than them, academically, participants would most likely write about someone of the same gender. It could be concluded that men and women rarely compare across the gender line, but it was found in the same study that male and female strive equally to attain a positive sense of self. Psychological distinctiveness. Males and females differentiate from each other primarily through perceived gender roles. When one member of a gender role is perceived to leave their respective role, they receive hate. This hate is usually through insult or argumentative language. Males and females are both attacked for their masculinity and femininity using insults and taunts from both the same and opposite genders. Many of what have been said about male and female gender identities can be said about those who do not identify with a male or female, but rather non binary or genderqueer identities.
In social identity theory, a social identity is a person's knowledge of what particular social category or group they think they belong in. This relates to gender roles because we automatically see what is put out in society and apply it to ourselves. Men and women seek to differentiate themselves because they feel the need to create a distinction as to how they identify themselves. In the Handbook of Theories of Social Psychology, it mentions a study where people were organized into mixed sex groups, both men and women, or same-sex groups, men only or women only. And the individuals were more likely to define themselves in terms of gender to accentuate their similarity to those of the same gender in the mixed-sex settings as opposed to when only men or women were present. According to Jen E. Stetz and Peter J. Burke in their journal article Identity Theory and Social Identity Theory, they state that we as individuals are already born into a structured society. Each person, however, has different social categories and therefore a different set of identities that make each person's self-concept unique. An article titled Gender Roles by Martin Eisend states that gender roles vary throughout different types of media, most notably found throughout advertisements. In the portrayals of men and women in advertisements, this initiates the assumption that advertisements typically present a male viewpoint of the world. These representations of men and women can create gender stereotypes, causing a disadvantaged woman and promoting idealized standards that are impossible to achieve. By taking on role identity, Persons adopt self-meanings and expectations to accompany the role as it relates to other roles in the group, and then act to represent and preserve these meanings and expectations. The meanings and expectations vary from person to person. Research done by Stutz and Burke found that the different gender roles in marriage result in different behaviors for both men and women, and how they are expected to act within the marriage given these gender roles.
Self-categorization theory. Self-stereotyping. This can be seen as a negative or positive impact based on how each person uses these ideas. Self-stereotyping includes integration of characteristics or traits of another person or group of people and combining them with the idea of yourself. These self-categorization stereotyping can be used to influence or change what their gender social identity should be. These two theories work hand in hand to impact the way a person thinks about themselves. The self-categorization theory is the theory of people putting others into these ideological groups based on their actions or behaviors. People use these very often, and they could be a positive or negative instinct. The theory explains how this is a habitual act, and it happens almost automatically in the human brain. Self stereotyping and self categorization theory go hand in hand when it comes to influencing a person. The way someone thinks about themselves is greatly affected by this phenomenon as well. People tend to use this stereotypical way of thinking to decipher their own gender identity. These theories are closely related because of the fact that they are both using assumptions based on previous encounters they perceived. Previous traits, behaviors, or actions are what influence these perception and therefore cause this self-categorization and self-stereotyping. Optimal distinctiveness theory. This theory is the theory that explains why people find the need to input themselves into groups of people or cliques. The theory describes the human need to provide oneself with a group to fit into based on two main needs. These two needs influence a person to push themselves into these social groups. Optimal distinctiveness is characterized by the balance of the two needs of inclusion and distinctiveness. Inclusion describes the need for a person to be included in a group or an organization of some sort. This need is just one of the two that defines the optimal distinctiveness theory. The other need is distinctiveness, and this need is the necessity of being distinguishable amongst a group of people. These two needs, or altogether, the optimal distinctiveness theory works hand in hand with the theory of self categorization. These two work hand in hand to influence a person to decide to insert themselves in a specific group or structure of people based on where they place themselves characteristically.
And in conclusion, we've seen how both men and women have different roles based on what society has expected from both the male and female genders. The examples we used for gender roles were females being traditionally caretakers, dressing more feminine, um, and being polite, while our examples for a traditional gender role for a male was being more masculine, being the head of the household, and being the bread maker. In addition to gender roles, we also seen how the impact of communication, both verbal and nonverbal, and how it's different for both the male and female genders. For the female gender, we've typically seen them use a lot of nonverbal language, such as facial expressions, touch, and physical contact. While the male we've seen, while the male gender we've seen typically has been the opposite and has, as we've mentioned previously, we believe the way genders communicate with each other, male to male, female to male, or female to female. We believe the way it comes down to how someone was brought up. In addition to gender roles, we've also explored the social identity theory, which is society or ourselves being put in a social category. Further meaning uh, ourselves uh, putting ourselves into a social category, or society putting us in a social category. Some of those social categories are um, based on our appearances, our beliefs, or our cultural standing. And this is where we see stereotypes play a factor in this, such as for gender reveals. Uh, Traditionally, blue is for a baby boy, and pink being for a baby girl. And finally, we've looked at social identity formation and how when you finally do find your identity, it can be positive, it can have a positive or negative connotation towards within society.